Hello, Deploy. My name is Kathleen Jewell, and I'm a developer at DigitalOcean. I work on the digital experience team, which is the team that powers DigitalOcean's community site, among other web properties. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about effective Kubernetes onboarding. Some of you may be familiar with the community platform already. We have a wide range of tutorials, questions, answers, and developer tools that are designed to spread awareness and knowledge of open source technologies. And I'll just say a quick word here too about our community writing program, Write for Donations, in case any of you want to share any of the interesting things that you're working on. Please either feel free to apply directly or reach out to me if you have questions about that process, and I'd be happy to answer them. So why am I here today? In this talk, I want to take you through some of the lessons that the community team has learned from both a content and a development perspective about effective Kubernetes onboarding. The goal is to give you some actionable tips that you can hopefully use the next time that you or your team need to get up to speed with Kubernetes. So how did we come to these insights? Well, as many of you are probably aware, DigitalOcean has a managed Kubernetes product, which was made generally available in May of 2019. Leading up to and following the release of that product, the core contributors on the community content team were tasked with the following project: Teach the World Kubernetes. So the push to develop content began. And here in the screenshot, you can see one outgrowth of that push for content, which is our Kubernetes for Full Stack Developers curriculum, which I'm going to discuss in more detail later. So, teach the world Kubernetes. Seems like a straightforward ask, right? Except, where do you begin? The content team was definitely going to need some operating principles to make this a meaningful endeavor. Otherwise, and I definitely would not recommend this approach, the team would just be creating content using a kind of scattershot approach, hoping to cover all relevant bases by some happy accident. So let me cut right to the chase and tell you about the approach the team used and the principles that they came up with to teach the world Kubernetes. First, know your audience and their objectives. Second, determine the best approach to meet these objectives. And then finally, scope your approach appropriately. And I'm going to have more to say about each of these in turn. Meanwhile, back on the community platform, a set of related questions and issues were arising among developers. We were in the process of moving our staging and production pipelines and environments to our internal Kubernetes clusters. Prior to this transition, we had been relying on some trusty, reliable, but ultimately outdated Ubuntu servers. Like the 97 Corolla that I drove until a few years ago, these servers had brought us far, but it was time to make the change. So the principles that I want to discuss today for onboarding teams and individuals to Kubernetes also stem from the work that the development team was doing on the platform side. Community is a Rails application, and it is staffed by a group of developers with web development backgrounds who are used to deploying in a more traditional VM environment. So deploying to Kubernetes meant involving the entire team in decision-making conversations around the changes, consequences, and trade-offs of using this new architecture. In talking about these principles today, I'm therefore going to combine insights from both the content and the development side, as I had the good fortune of both contributing content to our Kubernetes curriculum and working on the development team that finalized community's transition to Kubernetes. So first, whenever you're getting anyone up to speed with Kubernetes or really any other major topic, the first question you want to ask is, who are you dealing with? Maybe you're primarily onboarding application developers. This group wants to be able to deliver on day-to-day tasks and set expectations, So they need to know enough about how their application environment is going to change in order to make the best and most informed decisions. So one example out of many here would be something like a cron job. Cron jobs work one way on a VM, but in a distributed environment, they need to be handled differently. So it's good for whoever is working on features that expect those jobs to be running to be informed about any relevant changes. Members of this group also need to be able to deploy. Or if they're not doing that themselves, they need to know how to get things up to a point where a deployment can happen. So for our team, deployment on Kubernetes would involve different processes from what we have been using on VMs. So no more Capybara, for example. So we needed to bring people up to speed on how moving to Kubernetes was going to affect the deployment process. Maybe you're primarily onboarding operators. Like developers, this group is going to need to know the processes, procedures, and tools that relate to deployment. However, it's also likely that they're going to be charged with things like automation, managing CI, scheduling backups, and other related tasks. Additionally, they might be asked to implement logging, monitoring, and alerting. So information for this group will likely cover different topics than information that's being tailored for application developers. Another possibility, maybe you're onboarding business decision makers or other stakeholders. So these could be the folks, for example, who are in the position to approve the headcount that you need to accelerate your development on Kubernetes. Information for this group will then be tailored around things like making financial decisions and really understanding the tech as it rolls up to top-level business goals. They also need to be able to see how and where team growth and development fit into longer-term business objectives. So with these ideas in mind, let's go back to the Kubernetes curriculum. Thinking about these groups as I've just described them, application developers, operators, business decision makers, ended up being central to how the content team thought about their content, right? Which consisted of new tutorials that were written exclusively for the curriculum, as well as existing content that they wanted to present in a new and meaningful way. At first, the team had considered using different tracks to present this material, right? Selecting material for application developers, operators, and then presenting it independently. But ultimately, they decided that because some of that material overlapped and would be of interest to multiple groups, they would opt for a choose-your-own-adventure style presentation. Materials were organized then in such a way that users could opt into the materials that were most relevant for them, for what they needed to achieve at that point. So they also put together something for business decision makers that they ended up deciding not to include in the curriculum itself. Ultimately, this became a white paper that was addressed to stakeholders who wanted a kind of bird's eye view of what Kubernetes would mean for the business, some of its benefits, and so on. So once you know who you're addressing, what approach should you take to onboarding them? If your audience includes application developers who need to be able to, develop with a distributed architecture in mind and deploy successfully, then you might consider the following topics as a way of establishing some theoretical foundations and covering what is needed to accomplish some practical tasks. First, you want to think about covering some basic 12FA principles for things like versioning, dependencies, configuration, state, and so on. Environment variables are a good example here, making sure that everybody knows what to refactor and who holds the keys for updating these variables wherever they might live. In our case, that's in Vault, but it could be in a different secret management platform. It might also be good to cover some modernizing topics, things like health and readiness checks and logging and monitoring. Even in cases where logging and monitoring are ultimately handled by other teams, application developers could still be responsible for things like making sure health and readiness endpoints exist and coming up with kind of application-specific logging outputs and so on. Containers are another pertinent topic here. What do they mean for your application? One way of covering this in practical terms could be setting up a local development environment with Docker and Compose to get folks familiar with what goes into an image and how a containerized stack might behave as a whole. For example, the community application sits behind Nginx, so having a local setup to replicate the deployed stack in its entirety has been a handy tool for illustration and getting the team comfortable with the entire setup. Finally, you want to make sure that whoever is deploying knows what is required for that process to be successful. Who is pressing the button, what button needs to be pressed, and what should folks do in cases of failures or necessary rollbacks. And while it may seem straightforward to just say that you're going to cover these topics, blockers might arise for the team as they process this information and try to look at what is required of them in order to get up to speed with the proposed changes. Right, ostensibly your team is spending work hours on this transition, so you want to help them avoid any blockers. So, one blocker might be the consideration, why is this necessary? What is a distributed architecture? How do containers actually really differ from VMs? And then, how is this going to really change how are the tools that I'm going to be asked to use now really change from what I'm used to using? So depending on where your developers are coming from and what their experiences are, it may be helpful to think about covering some meta-level topics during your onboarding process. Ultimately, this can involve your team more closely in the decision-making process, right? Since a meta-level understanding of containers, modernized applications, so on, will allow them to extrapolate and get out ahead of problems that could arise in their own domain of expertise. One helpful approach is to separate out larger topics, like what is Kubernetes? What are containers? What are the components of a distributed architecture, from operational topics, like how do I extract my application configuration, or how do I ensure that my app is stateless? Again, it's important to understand the needs of your group, right, and what they have experience with, as well as what they're trying to accomplish ultimately. For the Kubernetes curriculum, for example, the team decided to address the need for a meta-level overview by having an introductory topics section that readers could opt into if they wanted. So this section covered things like basic system architecture, core objects, and other key foundational concepts. Since the audience for the curriculum was theoretically everyone, this seemed to make the most sense, and the team assumed that it would be helpful for many people, if not necessarily reading for all. So we thought that, its place as like a prefatory section made the most sense. Meanwhile, back on the community platform team, we were giving regular updates on our progress as we conducted testing for our production rollover, though we did break some of the decision-making discussions down into smaller stand-ups for the core folks who were involved on the infrastructure side. We also created some internal documentation to give a high-level overview of where information was now going to be located in the application. So things like deployment manifests and pipelines for concourse and so on. We also created some detailed guides on how to deploy to staging and production, as well as how to roll back and how to redeploy. Overall, we focused on taking a highly operational approach to information sharing. Some of the topics that we focused on, making sure that everyone understood as we move forward towards the final rollover, included things like understanding where secrets are located, understanding what's in the application and server base images, how to troubleshoot concourse, right, and then how to kick off and roll back deployments. It turns out, though, that we had failed to cover some of the meta-level nuances of what it really meant to deploy in a distributed environment. So we saw this most clearly in how we were initially thinking about scheduled jobs, which changed over the course of our discussions as we talked through the anticipated architecture in more detail. So once everyone was on the same page with the kind of higher level structure of the architecture, we were able to come up with a solution to ensure that scheduled jobs ran as expected between our two clusters. Some of the key learnings that we took away from this were it's okay to break folks out in terms of operational responsibilities, like having a dedicated group to deal with infrastructure in a more granular way. And it's also fine to organize information around operational goals like app development, deployment, so on. But it's also a good idea to sync on meta-level changes to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And in retrospect, I would recommend doing that at the beginning of a major transition process rather than in the middle. So the last thing I want to touch on today with onboarding is scope. Once you know who you're dealing with and what their objectives are, as well as the approach that you want to take to meeting those objectives, then you need to think about how you're going to scope that communication process. There are various formats that you can consider. Docs are a great way, for example, to communicate information asynchronously. And they also offer a great way to create self-selecting pathways through a body of material, which can be handy if you have a lot to cover. So, for example, the Kubernetes curriculum offered a topical and self-selected pathway through a lot of materials. As I've mentioned, each cluster of tutorials in a section rolled up to a particular audience, developers, operators, with topics that pertain to the goals that these users might have. Similarly, the Kubernetes docs themselves offer a self-selecting pathway where readers can find information on core concepts and particular operational tasks. Another way that you can incrementally expand the scope of your documentation without actually changing your approach substantially is what I like to think of as a unique feature of DigitalOcean's technical tutorials. So these are small, almost a positive level, phrase level explanations of particular tools, topics, and technologies. They're relatively cheap to include in terms of the space and effort required, but they can integrate a kind of meta-level coverage of topics into what are otherwise operational discussions. Basically, a good rule of thumb is that if you're looking to add this type of dimension to your docs, when in doubt, define. Another great format for onboarding is a recorded talk. At DigitalOcean, for example, we do Munch and Learns every Wednesday with topics like Ceph 101, writing Kubernetes controllers, and Concourse best practices, and more. So these are great ways to scope a topic down and focus it on developers and operators. They are also an excellent way to help foster company-wide best practices. Finally, though I hesitate to add meetings to anyone's calendar, strategically, meetings can be a great way to save time and get everyone on the same page. Speaking from our experience on community, I would say it's handy to have an agenda for these meetings, particularly if you are getting folks acquainted with Kubernetes for the first time. Even a few minutes spent at the top of a meeting doing a kind of high-level architectural overview can save you time down the road. Also, your approach doesn't need to be only one of these formats. In general, I would say, your approach is going to narrow as you move through these formats. Docs, for example, tend to anticipate a wider audience by virtue of their persistence over time. Talks vary, of course, but in the format that I've described, which is a kind of quick half-hour onboarding, you will need to limit your topic by dint of necessity. So, your topic will be something that you can cover reasonably in a half an hour for a defined audience. And finally, in a meeting, you're speaking directly to a group that shares the same context. So your topic will most likely be highly specific. In this format too, you can safely make assumptions about the shared knowledge and shared objectives of the audience, since the audience is your teammates and colleagues. So on Community, we took a kind of composite approach, combining most of the things I've mentioned here. We did some focus meetings. We shared internal documentation. We shared video resources, some of the Munch and Learns that I mentioned earlier. We also created a local Docker environment so we could look at how the stack behaved locally. And in retrospect, I would say the team has adapted really well to these changes in both environment and processes. Everybody knows what they need to do to get their job done. And people feel really positively about the move to Kubernetes. Our community serves about 4 million visitors a month, and Kubernetes definitely gives us things in security and scale, other forms of insight that we didn't have before. And this has been really invaluable for us. Did we make everybody a Kubernetes power user in this process? I would say no, but that wasn't the goal. Instead, we wanted to empower the team to do their best work on the day-to-day. And we wanted to be able to extend, knowledge of the architecture throughout the team's other work. So it could inform the decisions that the team made on the day-to-day level, and also ensuring that everybody's able to hit their goals and meet their expectations. All right, well, that is it for me. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of Deploy.